Welcome. I'm very happy to be sharing with you news about the new Brown Executive Functions / Attention Scales that we expect to be able to release in December 2018. And these are improved versions of scales that were published earlier. Some of you are probably familiar with the Brown scales that came out for ADHD in 1996 for adolescents and for adults. And then in 2001, we brought out the scales for children from 3 years old up to adolescents. These are completely new scales that are based upon an updated model of ADHD as impaired executive function. And I'd like to tell you about it. I hope you'll find it interesting, and I think you'll find that these scales provide a more effective tool for getting the full range of impairments that are associated with ADHD. Because I'm sure you understand, there's been a big change in the way we think about ADHD over the past decade. For a long time, this disorder, which was originally written up in the medical literature in 1902, was thought about simply as a problem with hyperactivity. And what's happened since then is that there have been some important changes made in understanding the disorder. The old model was very much focused upon disruptive behavior. The little kids who couldn't sit still, wouldn't shut up, and were driving everybody nuts at home and in the classroom. And what's increasingly emerged over the last 10 to 15 years is a recognition that this disorder is really much more complicated, and that it is often not involved with problems of behavior. Many times it is, but there are some kids who have ADHD and some adolescents and adults who have ADHD who've never had any significant behavior problems, where their difficulties are much more in the range of executive functions that pertain primarily to attention. More about that in just a couple of minutes. When we're talking about executive functions, there are a number of different descriptions of that term and definitions of the term in the literature, but basically what we're talking about is a wide range of very central control processes of the brain that serve to connect and to prioritize and to integrate cognitive functions for us moment by moment. And the metaphor that I often use for thinking about this is if you picture a symphony orchestra where all the musicians are really very good at playing their instruments. Regardless of how good they may be, if you don't have a conductor who can select what they're going to play and get each one to play his or her specific part in the same piece at the same time and keep the whole orchestra on time, without a good conductor, you're not going to get very good music out of a symphony. And the problems involved in executive functions when they're impaired are not comparable to impairments in one specific part of the brain. They're involved in those neural networks that function as the conductors of the brain's symphony. Muriel Lisak, whom most of you would know from her pioneering work on neuropsychological assessment, once spoke about it and said, you know, the executive functions are those which deal with the question, will you do it? And if so, how are you going to do it? And when are you going to do it? Now, if you take this apart, you realize that what we're looking at are issues that have to do with motivation and with activation, being able to get started on things. How will you do it? Addresses issues of planning and organizing and prioritizing. And when are you going to get around to it? The timing, being able to estimate when it needs to be done and how to do it. And then very much involved in that, of course, is working memory of being able to keep track of what you intend to do and what you just finished. Now, when you begin to think about those functions, one of the things that's very clear for all of us who have worked with individuals who are kids when they're little and adolescents and with adults is that these capacities, these executive function capacities, develop through childhood into adolescence and beyond. They're not fully present at all in early childhood. And we know this in terms of the way the curriculum for a school is designed and the way that we as parents bring up our kids. You expect different things of kids as they get older. and you sort of expect some difficulties that they're not being able to manage this task or that task when they're 5 or 6, but then when they're 6 or 7, you expect, well, it should be coming along, and moving it up from the point of learning how to cross the street safely or going up and down the stairs safely without somebody holding their hand to eventually getting into the things that are scarier for parents, like watching their kids learn how to drive the car. So we've got these environmental demands that increase with age, and those are basically established on the basis of what daily life is in terms of what you can see a child being able to do. Actually, executive functions are among the last aspects of the brain to develop, and for most people, they are not actually fully matured until at least like 18, 19, 20 or beyond. And the DSM speaks about how executive function, the ADHD symptoms are supposed to be manifest in some ways, at least by age 12. It used to be 7, now it's 12. But the fact is, we're talking about a wider range of problems now that include many things that are not included in the DSM-5. And sometimes you can see it, often you can see it by age 12, but sometimes it doesn't, particularly with really bright kids. You often do not see it until they get a little bit older, adolescents and late adolescence. Now, I'd like to share with you a model. Some of you may have read some of the things I've written about this or heard me talk before, and I hope you won't be bored, because I'd like to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the model that I've developed for talking about executive functions. This is one that I undergirded the scales that were published earlier. The scales that came out in '96 for adolescents and adults included only the first 5 of these categories. That was because at the time we started out trying to identify problems of inattention in people who were not hyper, and then we learned that by researching and testing it that exactly the same problems were characteristic of the people who had the behavioral problems as well. And so, starting with the scales that I published in 2001, we've used this 6-cluster model. Let me make a couple of general comments about it, and then I'll talk just to give a few specific examples of what sort of things each of these includes. The first thing is to say that the little boxes at the bottom, activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action, those are not labels for unitary variables. It's not as though we're talking about something like height or weight or blood pressure, which is all one thing and you just have more or less of it. Rather, you might think about these categories as simply baskets of related cognitive functions. And as you look at them, and we'll talk about each of them a little more separately, what you realize is that these things operate dynamically. That most of the tasks that we do that involve executive function, where we don't have someone else walking us through it and saying, okay, now do this, now do that, but where we have to be able to have an idea of what we're trying to do and how to do it, involve dynamic interaction between these various functions. And they're not all localized in one part of the brain. This is a very dynamic process that involves many networks in the brain. And the third thing to know about it is that these are operating mostly unconsciously. Now, I'm not talking about unconscious in the sense of repression in the psychoanalytic literature. No, I'm talking about the more modern notion of automaticity, that they happen so fast that you don't stop to think about them. They're integrated in the way that you have to do when you're trying to drive your car, or when you're typing up an email, or when you're carrying on a conversation, where there may be some things that come up that you have to deliberately think about, but many of these functions are operating automatically without conscious control. So let's take a look at what this is referring to. I'm not going to go over all components of it, but just give you an idea of what each of these different clusters is referring to. I'll have a few more detailed examples later. But the organize, prioritize, and activate has to do with being able to get started on tasks and to organize and prioritize to be able to do that. And I think all of us who work in this field know that some of the kids that we see and some of the adolescents and adults that we see have a lot of difficulty organizing their stuff, their backpacks, their desks, their living space, unless somebody else is helping them take care of it. Others don't have much trouble at all organizing their stuff, but they have a lot of trouble organizing their time and their work and figuring out, okay, how long is it going to take to do this job or that job? And to be able then, critically, to get started on it. The third bullet there is talking about the problems involved in procrastination, which is one of the central difficulties of a lot of folks with ADHD. That they have an idea of, yeah, I'm going to do that, but they have a lot of trouble getting themselves started often until the very last minute, where they feel like they have a gun to their head and that if they don't take care of this right now, it's going to be a big problem. But it's this cluster of functions of being able to organize and, not just stuff, but also time, which involves figuring out how long is this going to take and which things should be first, second, and third, and then actually getting started. Those are the things that are typical of this particular cluster of cognitive functions that we call executive. But let's go on, because rarely do these things operate alone. This talks about focus. And sometimes people get the notion of this as focus as sort of locking in on something and neglect the fact that you also have to be able to shift your focus and sustain attention to tasks. And that we certainly know that a lot of the people that we see who have ADHD have difficulties holding focus and staying on a task. But it's also true that many of them get stuck on a task and have a difficult time transitioning to one thing or another. Often they're easily distracted, and you'll find that they sometimes are being distracted by other noises in a classroom, for example, somebody talking out in the hall or looking out the window. And other times the distractions come internally, just other thoughts that they have as they are going on. And one thing that I'd like to emphasize, although it's not on the slide, is all of the characteristics that I'm going to be talking about here as characteristics of ADHD and impaired executive function are problems all of us have sometimes. It's just that there are some people who have a lot more difficulty with it than others. So when we're thinking about this, we've always got to compare how is this individual at this age, at this particular point in his or her life, functioning on these things compared to other people in the same age group. But let me mention about the third bullet here, something that I think of as very important in this particular set of rating scales. And it was included in the earlier scales that we published, but it's now even more explicit in these, and that is the situational variability of the symptoms. And let me just give you one example here. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes, and that is in reading. If you ask someone, do you have difficulty when you're reading, where you can keeping track of things and then remembering what you've read? If you don't stipulate whether you're talking about reading something they're really interested in or something that's just been assigned where they don't particularly feel interested in it, you may not get a very adequate answer. Because most of the patients I've seen, and there are quite a few of them, little kids, teenagers, and adults, will tell me that when I'm reading something that is really interesting to me because it's